Okay. Welcome to the Homesick to Happy Movers podcast. I am Keisha Ellingson, and I help people who move to a new area develop, heal homesickness by creating connections and friends in their new area, even if you are super shy. So today we're talking with Erika, and Erika is an author in the Homesick book collaboration. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you for having me, Keisha. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be good. So could you share a little bit about who you are and what you do with the listeners?
So I am a certified nutritarian coach, which is plant-based whole food nutrition. And I help moms holistically elevate their life, not just with nutrition, but with natural remedies and other modalities so that they can have the energy and vitality that they need to achieve their goals, take care of their families. And I do this even if they are overwhelmed or exhausted.
Yeah, and you hit on a very key point, overwhelmed and exhausted, but
Yes.
making it easy. That's awesome. So could you share about what you wrote in your chapter?
Yes. So I grew up in the Midwest. I am a farm girl. I grew up on a farm, and I came from a rural area. And then I moved. I went to college. I met my husband at college. We got married. We had a baby while we were at college. And then we moved to his home state, completely different state. We came to California, and moving into a city, moving into it really is a completely different culture. It's a bit of a culture shock coming from rural Midwest to a California city.
Yes.
And even in as cities go in California, the city that we're in is not considered like a big city, but to me, it was huge. And it has grown quite a bit since I came here at the beginning. But that's the move that I talk about. It was a big deal for me, and not just the culture shock, but we also moved in with my husband's parents. And if any of you listeners out there have lived with in-laws before, it can be an experience. And I have a really good relationship with my in-laws to this day, and I love them to death. But it was hard. It was just hard. I didn't know them very well to begin with because I was at college when I met their son, and we got married. And yes, I met them for the wedding, and but we really didn't know each other well. And then I just moved in with them, so they weren't complete strangers, but it was different, and they ran their house differently than my parents had run their house, and we didn't have very much privacy either. That was the biggest thing that I struggled with. And I came from a family with a lot of kids, so I was like, no big deal, right? His brother and his sister are living there, no big deal. But we had one tiny bedroom to ourselves with our baby as well. And then his brother was on one side and his sister was on the other side. And if we talked even in a normal voice, they could hear us. So the privacy I really struggled with. And when we would have arguments sometimes, and they would hear everything. And it was embarrassing to me, and they never did anything or said anything that was mean or anything in any way. They were always really kind, but it was just the privacy it was hard. It was just hard for me. So I would say that's the biggest thing that I struggled with right there.
Yeah, and it's also hard going from having privacy back to not having a lot of privacy.
Yes, we had been married for 2.5 years, all by ourselves in our little apartment, and it was good, and we had come, marriage, just starting out in marriage, you have a lot of ups and downs as you learn to live with this other person that you didn't grow up with, and And so there are ups and downs with that. But when you have the privacy that you can work things out and not be overheard by others, it makes a difference. It really does.
Right. Yeah. Where you're comfortable enough to communicate.
Yes. Yes. And at times when we were living with his parents, I wasn't comfortable to communicate, or I wanted to go somewhere else to communicate because I needed to be able to be free with what I was saying.
Mhm.
So, and his brother and sister were only there for 4 months, and then they went back to college. And then we lived there the rest of the time that we were there. We were there for 18 months. And the rest of the time, it was just us. And we moved, we had 2 bedrooms instead of 1, and it was much better after that. But those first few months were hard, and I cried. There were times when I just cried.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on a good point that like it's so hard at the beginning with it's not just the move, but it's all the different things that come with a move and the
Yes,
different situations and the different town culture and all those things that we have to navigate at the same time.
right. And getting lost, right? My husband knew where to go. So when he was driving, great. But if he wasn't with me and I was going somewhere, I had no idea where I was going. And there was no navigation back then. I lived in the dark ages.
Yeah.
And so I would get these little handwritten notes, like people would tell me where to go. But then sometimes it would be like, go to this landmark and then turn right. And I would be like, what's that? Everybody knew what it was, but I didn't, you know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to navigate now, even with GPS, when people are talking about landmarks or like they're like, oh yeah, it's just like so many miles past this big bluff is what they
Yeah.
use landmarks here. But like as a newcomer, and this might sound strange to somebody who's been in their one area their whole life, but as a newcomer, you don't understand some of the language that they use when they're referring to local places.
Yeah. Sometimes they use letters, they abbreviate into letters, but the sign on the building has the whole name. And so if you don't catch that, you totally miss it because they called it these letters and it's this big name on the sign. And you're like, I didn't see what you're telling me was here.
Right? Yeah. Because usually what people are referring to is like how they see it, right?
Mhm.
They were trying to navigate everything and see the world how somebody else see it. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, I got lost a few times. Got lost going into other cities, and I do talk about one of those experiences because I don't know if you know the name Stockton, California.
Mm-mm.
I live about half an hour away from Stockton, and it is known to be like this thug city. Okay. It's known for not being the safest place. And I came from rural Midwest. Everything was safe where I was. Like it was just a safe place
Right.
where I was. And I got lost once and ended up in Stockton. And I talk about that in the chapter, but I was scared because my husband had told me never go there by myself. And there I was by myself in
Right.
Stockton, lost, and I didn't know what to do. And so, yeah,
Right.
so when you move, like, especially if you're moving from a rural area to a city, and there are places in some cities, especially bigger cities, where you shouldn't be going if you don't know the area. If you don't know where you're at, you should not be going to certain places. It's dangerous.
Right.
And so that's something when you're moving, especially to a big city, you've got to be aware of that. Or if you're near a big city and you're going into that city, you need to be aware of where you should be driving and where you shouldn't be driving.
Mhm.
Even parks and stores that you should or shouldn't be going to. And you can only get that information from a local person.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's a blessing when they do share that information.
Yes, yes. And but it's something you can ask for specifically. Are there some places I shouldn't be, that
Yep.
aren't safe?
And it's a good conversation starter too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what were the things that helped you overcome some of the struggles that you dealt with during your move?
Um, One thing, and this has taken time for me, just communication. Um, and I wasn't super great at it. When I was younger, I really wasn't. But trying to talk about my feelings or trying to express some of my struggles. And I really was trying. I didn't always come out, things didn't always come out the way that I wanted them to, or they weren't received in the way that I thought they would be received. But talking about things is so important, and everybody's in a different place with their communication skills. And I know I've come a long way from where I was at that time, but I was trying,
Right.
trying to communicate, um, both with my husband and also with my in-laws. Um, and they were pretty good with that. Like we talked about some ground rules when we moved in. And I think that's really, really important because I've had family members living in my house since then, siblings, my sibling or my husband's sibling, and and sitting down right at the beginning, especially, and just talking about, okay, we're going to do this, we're not going to do that, this is okay, this is not okay, this is what I expect, and this is what you can expect, and just getting all of that out on the table at the beginning, and then revisiting it because things change or things come up that you may not have thought of.
Right.
So revisiting it and just keeping it top of mind so that everybody has a good experience. Because if you're not communicating and you have different expectations, that's when things can happen that are not pleasant.
Right.
So that was one thing I think we did pretty well. And it probably wasn't even me. It was my husband's family communicates pretty well. So they
Mhm.
taught me a lot with the communication.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had someone living with us for a while,
Hmm.
and we did not do like okay, here are the ground rules. Um,
Mm.
and I found that like there are people who have completely different standards of living,
Yes.
and what's acceptable and what is not. And it was hard to address the issue afterwards, like
Yes.
after something had already taken place that wasn't acceptable in my eyes, but was acceptable in theirs eyes. So I think your advice of just have that conversation right away
Hmm.
and like get some good expectations of like what this is going to look like, right? Like talk about it right away because then you can avoid some things down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you continually are keeping the conversation open, then you can nip things in the bud, or you can bring things up before they become like a really big problem. And if
Yeah.
you have kids involved, like if you're moving in and you have kids, or you're moving in and they have kids, or any way it goes, that brings in a whole different element than just adults,
Right.
and so laying ground rules with kids, like what's okay and what's not okay, like with discipline or
Mhm.
feeding, or like there are so many different things. Um, and so laying those ground rules as well is is very, very important so that
Yeah.
nobody crosses the line, because really we want to exist together and be and have good experiences, and nobody really wants to cross a line. um, I think most people don't intend to cross lines, but if they don't know where the lines are, then they're going to cross them because they just don't
Right.
know.
Yeah. I heard a quote. I forget who sang it, but the quote said, "To be clear or to be unclear is to be unkind."
Mm,
I heard that as like, oh, that is so true. Like the clearer that I can be is the kinder I'm being to the people around me. And
mhm,
I want people to be clear with me, like
mhm.
to say what they're thinking and to say like their expectations so I know, because it makes it so much easier if I know what they're expecting.
Right. And even with the level of cleanliness, like we all grew up in homes and there's a certain level of cleanliness that is the norm or the acceptable, and there's a certain level of cleanliness that is not acceptable. And everyone's family has a different level of acceptable cleanliness. And in my in-laws' house, we ran into that. My level of cleanliness was not their level of cleanliness. And they had never had a little child living in that house before. Like they moved there after their kids were a little older. And so they didn't have a tiny child. They also didn't have a big messy child like I was at the time. And I needed to have things at my fingertips, and there just weren't places to put my things in the living areas, because it wasn't my house, and
Right.
so I made piles of my stuff that I needed, and that was not acceptable. And so they were never mean about it. They just said, please clean it up.
Right.
But for me, I'm like, I need my stuff. I
Hmm.
need my stuff. And part of it was because I'd had an injury. And so going up and down the stairs, and especially carrying my child up and down the stairs repeatedly to get my stuff over and over, it was painful. And so for me, it was hard. That part of it was hard. And and also we just didn't have the same level of acceptableness. Like for me, a little, like, you should see my desk. I've got piles on my desk because I need things right at my fingertips. Because that's how I work.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting that like usually people know. They know how they work or what their style of
Mhm.
cleanliness is, but it's something that we tend to assume that everybody has the same style.
Mhm.
Um, my husband and I grew up in very different styles. Like
Mhm.
both are pretty clean, but like I feel like his style is like above and beyond um,
Mhm.
what I grew up with. And it is interesting because earlier on, we I realized that we're both expecting our styles.
Mhm.
And it was like the need to communicate and just really talk about it, have that conversation. Even though
Mhm.
sometimes it can be a hard conversation, it's good to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Really important. Like the communication again, once again, just all around. That's like the number one priority when you're moving in with family or even with friends. The communication, that is the biggest thing, because if you can have good communication, you can leave that situation when you're done with that still on good terms and
Right.
still loving each other. um
Yes.
and
Yeah. Yeah. And maintain that friendship.
right,
Yes.
and
That's
I'm
awesome.
very grateful that's how we left it, and we've had a good relationship for many years. So I am super grateful about that.
Yes. Yeah. So what encouragement did you share for the readers in your chapter?
So positive attitude, like just being cheerful and looking for the good, um, is something that will help you in every area of your life, not just moving, but looking for that good. And for me, prayer. I rely on God to help me in many different situations, and the inspiration that I get when I pray really helps me with my relationships, and helps me to keep that cheerful attitude even when things are not what I think is perfect, right? Because
Right.
life isn't perfect. There are things that happen all the time, but when we can keep a positive attitude and keep an attitude of I'm going to learn from this situation. It may not be my favorite situation, but I am going to try and learn from it and keep going and just keep a positive attitude. That's my biggest piece of advice there.
Yeah, yeah. So for the readers or people who are listening right now, who've been or are going through your exact same situation of moving in with in-laws or moving in with someone else, what is one action step that you would encourage them to take?
Have the courage to speak and have that communication when it's necessary, and don't wait until it has festered or gone too long that it has become a big deal. Have the courage to speak when it's little. Have the courage to just and do it calmly, because when something's just a little thing, you can be more calm about it. But when it has festered, or when it has been a long time, or repeated things that have happened that you're not happy with, it makes it a bigger deal. So have courage to speak first, the first time something happens, and open that communication so that people know how you feel. And it's not necessarily you're doing something wrong. It's just, this is how this situation makes me feel. And is there something that we can do to find a solution so that we both feel good about this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that advice is really key to younger movers. I know
Mm-hmm.
that when I was younger, I don't know if I didn't learn that skill or I just wasn't confident enough to voice when I had a different opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And me too. And this move, like, I am quite removed from the move that I wrote about, because it was 22 years ago for me. And I am a different person now than I was 22 years ago. I've learned things, I've grown, and I have gotten better at communication. So, and looking back, I know that that piece of advice would have helped me in some of the situations that I waited too long to bring something up, when it wouldn't have been a big deal if I just talked about it right at first.
Right, right. Yes, that's awesome. So, do you plan to continue your writing career?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I have written in several book collaborations, anthologies, whatever you want to call them. And I have a list of books. I have some children's books that I'm working on, and I plan to write some longer books as well. So, yes, definitely, I will be continuing to write.
Okay, awesome, awesome. So, where can the listeners connect with you?
Well, I have a website, holisticsupermom.com. And then also on Facebook, I have a group that's open to any moms. I'm sorry, dads, you're not invited. This is only a mom's group. It's called Holistic Super Moms. And it is, that name sometimes triggers people that are like, I am not a super mom and I don't want to be. But in my view, every mom is a super mom, because you're trying your best. And we all are trying our best in different ways. And this group, we talk about lots of different holistic ways that we can support ourselves and our kids, our families. And so come on in and see what we've got going in there.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and it sounds like we do have some similar experiences as well.
Yes.